Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Men with Wings from 1938. And this is potentially concluding my quest to review all of the films directed by William A. Wellman. One of the things that goes throughout Wellman's whole filmography is flight, and the fact that he was a flyer in World War I and fought for the Lafayette Flying Corps. It really meant a lot to him, but also because he directed probably one of the greatest films about flight of all time, and probably one of the greatest war epics and greatest films about flight in war, which was Wings. And he kept making films about flight. None of them became classics like Wings, even though that was his background, even though he did fly. He even flew a plane and landed it on Douglas Fairbanks's lawn. He didn't make too many, but he made quite a few. It's a part of his filmography that, unless you're like me and you're going through all of his films, you wouldn't really notice. But what's interesting about his later films about flight, and particularly like this film and Gallant Journey, is there's someone who doesn't just care about the thrill of flight, why people love flight, and what's so amazing about it, but also the history of aviation. And there seemed to be somebody who is incredibly fascinated by all aspects of airplanes. So it makes sense that he would be the one to direct a film like Men with Wings. And really, I think he was probably the only one who could. This one, probably more so than Gallant Journey, really combined an entertaining Hollywood kind of epic with a lot of information about aviation history and the thrill of aviation and how all of that can change over time. He brings all of the lessons he learned from making melodramas and women's pictures and combines it with something he loves. It's less of a war picture. It's the kind of interesting find in a filmography that I wish it wasn't as unavailable as it is. It's probably surprising how good it is. And I think it brings to mind how good Wellman was kind of in the late 30s, a period that, although we talk about Beau Geste and A Star is Born and Nothing Sacred are all fairly well regarded and fairly easy to find, a lot of his other films aren't as widely recognized, and they're still just as well directed. And this is kind of like his spectacular epic after having two of the biggest hits he had ever had, with A Star is Born winning the Oscar also for writing, and then Nothing Sacred, which was another big hit. And then he comes out and kind of makes his artistic epic, and it kind of says a lot about him as a director, where he definitely has something to say, but he still wants to entertain and give the audience exactly what it wants. It's kind of like the perfect studio director kind of artistic epic. Two friends, Pat and Scott, and this girl Peggy, who all grow up together loving aviation. And one day when Peggy's father, who used to be a newspaperman but then decides that he wants to get into flight, he loves flight, he heard about the Wright brothers and was very excited, and decides to get into the flight business at the beginning of it and builds his own plane and tries to break a flight record. And he goes pretty far and he flies for a little bit, but then he crashes and his plane bursts into flames and he dies. And Peggy is obviously very upset, and the boys are pretty shocked by it, but that doesn't deter them. They're still into aviation. And Pat, played by Fred McMurray, Scott, played by Ray Milland, and Peggy, played by Louise Campbell, they all are very much into flight and aviation and are trying to build their own kind of planes and sell designs. And as they eventually get scouted by someone and brought into an aviation company, but Pat is very bored by this and kind of gets in an argument with a superior and leaves, while Scott stays around for a little bit. Pat leaves and then goes to World War I. Scott sticks around for a little bit, but then goes himself and helps out and designs and is an engineer. And then as they come home, Pat is a war hero and has married Peggy, who has also gone to help the World War I effort. They get married in Paris in the rain, in a very William Wellman trademark. And there's kind of a love triangle between the two men with Peggy, but unlike a lot of Wellman films that have the love triangle between two men and one girl, in this version of that love triangle, Ray Milland's character is kind of silent about it. You can definitely tell it's not like an invisible thing or something, but he never really does anything with it. He's very silent about it, which is an interesting take since Wings. Wings did that, obviously, but that happened in quite a few Wellman films. After World War I, Pat, who's Pat Falconer, opens a company called Falconer. He becomes the president of Falconer Aviation Company, and that becomes bigger and bigger as Ray Milland, Scott, is building planes. And eventually Pat doesn't like being at home, even though his wife is pregnant, and keeps going to conflict because he loves flight flight more than designing the planes, and Ray Milland's character is kind of the opposite. And you see how time and aviation history changes these three people. One of the things that's interesting about Men with Wings is how Wellman's very good at showing history but not making it look boring. It doesn't feel as stuffy. It feels very alive. It feels very natural. And that's something I saw in a previous Wellman film, The Conquerors, which came out before this. And this has a similar vibe to it. I think The Conquerors might be a better movie, but Men with Wings understands how to show that in a more human way, how to just sprinkle the historical facts around. Not to just have it be just about the facts. It's almost more about these three people and how their lives change, and they're building up this company and becoming flyers and flying in World War I, and their impulsive decisions. You kind of understand why Pat wants to fly more than be a president. You understand why Scott would want to stay behind. You understand Peggy's motivations. It all kind of makes a lot of sense. And because it's more about character than the facts, that's really what makes these films come alive. I think Men with Wings sounds like something that could be a lot more boring than it was, but it was a film I really got into. And a film that I think says a lot about flight and flight throughout the ages and the kind of people who would want to do this. Wellman often talks about how flyers are kind of these crazy, insane people. I think one of his ex-wives, before he met the wife he was with the longest, Dottie, was a flyer, and he said flyers should never be married to each other. Flyers are crazy people. Now, flight, you think of a pilot, and they're very responsible, they're very well-tempered. You think of Sully Sullenberger. But in Men with Wings, you get the craziness to it, the impulsiveness. You also get how this was such a big deal at the time, how this is a rising technology. I don't think we think of flight that way now. The way Men with Wings talks about flight is kind of like looking at a film now that would talk about the internet. When you look at a film like that now, it's really interesting to us as a modern culture because that's something we talk about, that's something we use all the time, that's something we're very interested in. And Men with Wings reflects a culture that was interested in this. This was a hit with critics. To my understanding, it was a hit with audiences. It seems kind of odd that it was so forgotten. I know he very much liked to make films about aviation, and Gallant Journey was a film he really cared about also, which I think is fairly comparable to this, although this is a fictional characters about aviation history. He also understands how to make flight really work, and one of the greatest things that he probably learned from Wings is if you shoot a flight and aviation very well, it will wow people. That's something that goes on from Wings to Top Gun to even How to Train Your Dragon. When you have amazing sequences of flight, that can really wow an audience. And Wellman knew how to do this, and the flight sequences in this film are very well photographed. Incredibly well photographed. You really feel like you're there. You really get the sense of not just the thrill of it, but how slow it can sometimes be, how fast it can sometimes be, the mechanics of it. It really feels like you're kind of there in a lot of places. Now, this was filmed on an early Technicolor process. I believe it was a 3-strip process, which the quality of the copy I have wasn't great, and no one's really restored Men with Wings, unfortunately. So it semi looks like there was a black and white film that got colorized, but a lot more natural. Colorization was ugly as all hell. This film has a beauty and majesticness to the Technicolor. He uses the Technicolor well, especially in the flight sequences. It seemed like he could use the clouds a lot more because he was using color. It seems like there was a little more play with the clouds than I'd seen in his other films about flight. And I like how he would, when a plane was taking off, the way they would shoot the plane taking off was like at a Dutch angle, which was a little odd. It kind of scared you a little bit, where you're like, is something bad gonna happen? Is this plane gonna just like burst into flames or something? Just the way they shot it, that angle, the Dutch angle, really worked for it and gave it more suspense, and it scared me, and I was worried. I was like, oh shit, this thing's gonna crash and explode into a ball of fire. It didn't, but spoilers, I guess. But that sense was there. This was so well shot with the aviation. It's probably one of his better shot films in terms of aviation films. I mean, obviously the best one's always going to be Wings, and this doesn't have the suspense and the thrills that Wings does. But I don't know if this film would really work for it. I think this is a lot more subdued. It's a lot more about these characters evolving. He has a great group of actors. I think Ray Milland has an important role because he has to play down how much he is in love with Louise Campbell's Peggy character. He's good at playing it quiet. He doesn't overdo it in certain scenes. He really keeps a certain tone to it that works throughout it. He's almost really the star of this movie because Fred MacMurray's character, although he's the cooler character, isn't in it as much. And he really is a great through line through it because he's not really taking taking like a star presence type of role, almost more of a subdued quality to it, but also doesn't make it boring. That might be why this film maybe isn't as well remembered, because it doesn't have a punchy kind of star role. It's not as exciting because of that, but I kind of liked Ray Milland's performance in it. Fred MacMurray playing Pat Falconer, you really get the sense of someone who's impulsive, someone who wants to go to World War I just to have the experience of flying. A lot of people say this character is based on William Wellman, since while Bill Wellman was a World War I war hero and did all this crazy stuff, and there's some similarities there, I think only slightly. Wellman didn't write the film. It was written by Robert Carson, who helped him write A Star is Born and The Last Gangster, and had worked with him as a writer, so maybe they did use parts of it, I don't know, but it seems like speculative, really. I kind of didn't get a real Wellman sense to Fred MacMurray. I don't think he was, maybe a little inspired by, but nothing more than that. But I liked Fred MacMurray. I look at him more as like My Three Sons kind of patriarch kind of guy, like a suburban dad, than I can from anything else. But I thought he played kind of more of an impulsive guy very well. It made me forget about the My Three Sons stuff. And Louise Campbell as Peggy, you get the weariness of life on her face, but you also get that she doesn't take any shit from Fred MacMurray's character, which I liked. And I liked Andy Devine. It's kind of just playing the sidekick role in this, but Andy Devine plays the sidekick role very well. I like seeing Andy Devine. I don't know. I think it's a shame that this film isn't as remembered, and I think Wellman, he had made this after making two major hit films for United Artists. He made this right before Beau Geste for Paramount, and he was really into making big epics. This is around the time he was making some of his great epics, and probably commercially at the top of his game around this time. You do get a sense of him as a studio director, but also the kind of stories he wanted to tell, and I think this is kind of more of his auteurish slant to it. Certainly, the late 30s aren't as well known for that as when he was at Warner's. This is actually more in that vein, because this feels like something he would very much want to talk about and want to make a film about, because this was something that was important to Wellman himself, which was flight and aviation history. And he tells it like someone who wants this film to mean something to you. He knows how to play this film as an audience. He's very experienced at this point. There's actually a part that was going to be in this film that was going to say how aircrafts really shouldn't be used for warfare, and supposedly the rumor is that the American government asked them to take that out, and they changed it to the ending that is in the film, where they don't even have that part. No one's sure if it was filmed or not, or just scrapped completely before they even shot it. But it's interesting that Wellman had that view on it, especially like this was 1938. This is right before Pearl Harbor and World War II and all that. It's interesting they didn't really want that in this film, and that Wellman had that view on aircraft in war. He was always one to go against the grain. That was a pretty extreme way to end the film. I don't know if it would have honestly necessarily worked. They might have just taken it out because it didn't really work for the movie, which to be honest seems to make a little more sense. I can imagine the government doing that, but it just didn't feel like it would have worked. This shows Wellman kind of calming down, being less impulsive, but almost being a little more calculated and understanding how to make a movie about aviation really work for an audience and critics. And he kind of made a real splendid motion picture, a real complete motion picture about that. And it shows his strengths as a director and a storyteller, that he could take a topic and he could take something that he very much cared about and get an audience to care about it, and to get it to be a story that you would be interested in. And I think that shows what made him such a good director, is he made very good studio, audience-friendly kind of movies. And this really showed how good he could be at that, while doing something that he cared about, a story he wanted the audience to care about, not just something that the studio made him do. And I think the studio kind of went after him for it, but I think this is a film that he really wanted. It's a film you can tell that passion through, and show how passionate of a director he could really be, especially when he was interested in something. And I kind of prefer this film than The Gallant Journey, although The Gallant Journey definitely has its moments. I think this film is exciting, and it shows how he used his sentimentality, as I've said before, to rip things down and show the passage of time, and how the passage of time is not sentimental at all. And this shows how very much a William Wellman epic, shot with aviation in a very William Wellman way. I've reviewed over 60 William Wellman films, I've read books, I've watched documentaries. This film didn't have to be the perfect way to encapsulate Wellman. I didn't know if it would or not. There's not that much information on it, but I think it was, because it shows the best of him as an auteur, him being personal, and him understanding how to get that personality and that auteurism to work, and also be a studio director. And I think that shows the kind of director he was, and that's what kind of also really honestly what makes Men with Wings such a fantastic epic of a motion picture. So if you have seen Men with Wings and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And if you would like to check out my William Wellman review playlist, I reviewed over 60 William Wellman films. This is probably the last of my William Wellman series. I've been doing these for over 2 years, but to be honest, there are no other William Wellman films I can find at this point. Like, this is it. Like, I can't find any more. If I do find any more, or if something becomes available that previously wasn't, of course I will review it and put it in the playlist. But until then, thank you everyone who's watched. If you are actually someone who's watched all of these, thank you very much. This is something I've always wanted to do since I've really been into movies, is to watch all the films of a classic studio director. And William Wellman was someone who always fascinated me and who I always thought was really interesting. And being able to piece that all together, not in order, unfortunately, but to be able to watch all of his films, or all the films of his that I can possibly find, has been a great thrill. And for everyone who has watched, or even watched half of them, or a few, or has gotten into William Wellman because of these, or whatever, thank you very much for watching, because this has been a real pleasure of my life to be able to have done something like this. It's something I've always wanted to do, but this is probably the end of anything to do with William Wellman, just because I don't see me being able to find one in the immediate future, but I'm going to keep looking nonetheless, so if it does, I will review it, of course. And it's been a really great series to do. My biggest series, a series that I never thought would go as long as it did, and it's very cool to have done it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time.